In the heart of Beverly Hills, where glittering chandeliers light up the night and luxury exudes from every corner, a modest figure stepped through the grand glass doors of Lumiere, the city's crown jewel of fine dining. Keanu Reeves, dressed in a simple white shirt, worn-out jeans, and scuffed boots, paused briefly at the entrance. His unassuming demeanor seemed almost out of place amidst the opulence, where polished marble floors and crystal accents reflected the affluence of the clientele. But Keanu paid no attention to the stares. Quiet and composed, he made his way to a discreet corner table, seeking solace in the background. The soft hum of live piano music filled the room, but it did little to mask the whispers that rippled through the diners. A woman in pearls leaned toward her companion, her voice hushed but unmistakably critical. "Do you think he's lost? He doesn't exactly look like Lumiere material." Her companion nodded subtly, both casting fleeting glances in Keanu's direction before returning to their perfectly plated entrees. Behind the reception desk, Sarah, one of the newer waitstaff, adjusted her tailored uniform. Her polished appearance and meticulously rehearsed smile were trademarks of someone striving to embody Lumiere's prestige. Yet beneath her professional exterior, Sarah harbored a certain pride, a kind that often spilled into quiet arrogance. Her sharp eyes scanned the dining room, finally landing on Keanu. Her brows furrowed slightly as she assessed him. The worn boots, the lack of designer branding, the understated presence. In her mind, a conclusion formed instantly. Straightening her posture, Sarah approached Keanu with a practiced smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Good evening," she greeted, her voice laced with subtle condescension. "Are you sure you're in the right place?" The words hung in the air, carrying just enough weight to catch the attention of a nearby table. A faint chuckle escaped from a man seated close by, though he quickly hid it behind his glass of wine. Keanu looked up at Sarah, his expression calm and unbothered as though the slight hadn't registered. "Yes, I'm sure," he replied, his tone polite yet firm. "I'd like a table, please." Sarah hesitated, her smile faltering ever so slightly. There was something unsettling about the man's steady demeanor, an air of quiet confidence that she couldn't quite place. Still, she pressed on. "Of course," she said, gesturing toward the farthest corner of the restaurant. "This way, sir." As Keanu followed her, the sound of hushed murmurs followed him, weaving through the room like an invisible thread. Sarah led him to a small table near the kitchen, far removed from the golden glow of the main dining area. The muffled clatter of dishes and faint chatter of staff created a stark contrast to the elegance of the room's centerpiece. "Here you go," she said, placing the menu down with a hint of finality. "I think you'll find this spot suitable." Keanu nodded, his faint smile unwavering. "Thank you," he said simply, settling into his seat. Sarah's lips tightened as she turned away, muttering under her breath just loud enough for a nearby couple to hear. "He won't last 5 minutes. Wait until he sees the prices." Across the room, an elderly man with neatly combed silver hair and a navy blue suit observed the interaction. He sipped his wine thoughtfully, his sharp eyes following Sarah's retreating figure before returning to Keanu. There was something about the quiet resilience in the man's posture, something that didn't quite align with Sarah's quick judgment. The night carried on, the glow of the chandeliers casting soft light across the dining room. But for one corner of Lumiere, the spotlight was just beginning to shine. Keanu sat quietly at the small, dimly lit table, his demeanor unchanging despite the deliberate slight. He opened the menu, his eyes scanning the lavish descriptions of gourmet dishes as the sounds of the restaurant swirled around him. The clinking of glasses, the hum of conversations, the subtle notes of the pianist. It was a symphony of affluence, and yet Keanu appeared untouched by it all. His calm presence was almost magnetic, drawing a few curious glances from other tables. Still, Sarah's dismissive muttering had planted a seed of quiet judgment among the patrons. Back at the bar, Sarah leaned against the counter, her lips curled in a smirk as she exchanged whispers with a fellow server. He's still sitting there, acting like he belongs. I give it 10 minutes before he asks for the check. Her co-worker, a young man with a kind face, glanced toward Keanu's table and frowned. Maybe he's just here to enjoy a nice meal. You don't have to be so hard on him. Sarah rolled her eyes dramatically, brushing off the comment. This is Lumiere, she replied, her tone sharp. We're not a casual diner. People like him don't fit in here. As Sarah spoke, the elderly man in the navy blue suit observed from his table nearby. He noticed how Sarah's laughter grew louder, how her gaze occasionally flicked toward Keanu, with a hint of disdain. With a measured sip of his wine, the man shook his head, his expression a mix of disapproval and curiosity. What kind of man could sit so serenely under such obvious scrutiny? Minutes passed, and Sarah finally made her way back to Keanu's table, her notepad in hand. She approached with a casual confidence, her steps quick and deliberate, as if she were doing him a great favor by taking his order. Have you decided? She asked, her tone clipped. Or do you need me to explain the menu? Keanu glanced up, meeting her gaze with the same quiet composure. I'll have the filet de Rossini, please, he said, pointing to one of the most expensive dishes on the menu. Sarah froze for a moment, surprised by his choice. She quickly recovered, stifling a laugh. The filet de Rossini, she repeated, her voice dripping with mock admiration. Just so you know, that's $350. Are you sure? Keanu's faint smile didn't waver. Yes, he said simply. It sounds wonderful. Her smirk deepened, and she scribbled down the order with exaggerated flair. All right then, she replied. Just to make sure there are no surprises later, I suggest you double-check the prices. We wouldn't want any misunderstandings. She closed her notepad with a snap and turned on her heels, leaving the table without waiting for a response. At the bar, Sarah placed the order slip down with a theatrical sigh. I don't get it, she muttered to her co-worker, her voice loud enough for others nearby to hear. Why do people like him come here? He's clearly out of his depth. Her co-worker, shifting uncomfortably, didn't reply. Instead, he busied himself polishing glasses, his silence a quiet disapproval of Sarah's attitude. Meanwhile, Keanu remained at his table, his posture relaxed, his eyes wandering the room as he waited. The elderly man watched him closely, noting the way Keanu's calm presence seemed to soften the edges of the bustling restaurant. It was as if the man carried his own sphere of tranquility, unaffected by the noise, the judgments, or the subtle ridicule around him. When the appetizer arrived, Sarah set the plate down with a deliberate force, causing it to slide slightly across the table. Here you go, she said, her voice laced with a thin veneer of politeness. I hope you enjoy it, or at least know what you're eating. Keanu looked at the dish, then back at Sarah, his smile unwavering. Thank you, he replied, his tone as steady as ever. Sarah leaned in slightly, her smirk returning. You know, she began, her voice dropping just enough to sound conspiratorial. A lot of people who order this dish end up not liking it. It's not exactly mainstream, but I think you'll manage. Good luck. Keanu met her gaze, his calm eyes holding hers for a moment before he simply said, It looks excellent. Thank you for your attention. Frustrated by his lack of reaction, Sarah straightened up abruptly and walked away, muttering under her breath. He won't even make it to the main course, she said to herself, casting a glance toward the kitchen. I bet he'll ask for tap water next. Across the room, the elderly man set down his wine glass and raised it slightly in Keanu's direction. The gesture was subtle, almost imperceptible, but Keanu noticed. He responded with a small nod and an appreciative smile, the unspoken exchange passing between two strangers who seemed to understand something deeper than the surface tensions of the evening. The piano continued its gentle melody, the crystal chandeliers glinting softly overhead. But beneath the polished veneer of lumiere, a quiet storm was brewing. Keanu's presence, his unshakable calm, was beginning to unsettle the very atmosphere of the restaurant. And it was only the beginning. As Keanu waited patiently, the tension in the room subtly began to shift. Sarah, still convinced that her initial judgment was correct, made a deliberate effort to prioritize other tables over his. She flitted around the dining room with exaggerated energy, stopping to laugh at a wealthy patron's joke, chatting with another about a recent gala, and ensuring that the center tables received her full attention. Keanu's table, tucked away in the corner, seemed forgotten in the grand orchestration of her performance. But Keanu was anything but perturbed. He observed the dining room with quiet curiosity, his eyes briefly resting on the glinting chandeliers, the pianist's swift fingers, and the elegantly dressed patrons, who were too consumed with their own meals to notice the subtle drama playing out. Occasionally, his gaze would meet that of the elderly man in the navy blue suit, whose quiet observation mirrored his own. Sarah, meanwhile, continued her subtle campaign. Each time she passed Keanu's table, she averted her eyes, quickened her steps, and pretended to be busy. Her actions weren't unnoticed. The elderly man furrowed his brow, his disapproval growing with each deliberate slight. Other patrons began to murmur, catching on to the uncomfortable dynamic. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Sarah returned to Keanu's table with his main course. The plate sat beneath a silver cloche, its presentation immaculate, though the delay in its delivery had been anything but professional. She placed it on the table with a brusque motion, the cloche rattling slightly as she removed it. "Here's your filet de Rossini," she said, her tone dripping with exaggerated politeness. "I hope it's everything you expected, and worth the wait." Keanu glanced at the dish, then back at Sarah, his expression as calm as ever. "Thank you," he said simply. But Sarah wasn't finished. She leaned in slightly, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "You know, this dish is meant for those who truly appreciate fine dining. It's quite sophisticated. Are you sure it's to your taste?" Keanu's faint smile didn't waver. "I'm sure," he replied. "Thank you for your concern." Frustrated by his unwavering composure, Sarah straightened abruptly and turned on her heels, muttering under her breath as she walked away. "Pretending to be polite," she scoffed to a nearby co-worker, who listened uncomfortably. "He's obviously out of his element. People like him always come here thinking they belong, but they just end up embarrassing themselves." Her co-worker glanced at Keanu's table, his discomfort evident. "Maybe he just wants to have dinner," he said softly. "Shouldn't we treat him like any other customer?" Sarah laughed, shaking her head. "Did you see what he's wearing? He doesn't belong here, and if he can't handle it, he shouldn't have walked through the door." As Sarah walked away, the elderly man finally decided to intervene. He stood up from his table, his movements slow and deliberate, and approached Keanu with a kind smile. "Good evening, young man," he said, his voice warm but firm. "I hope you don't mind me interrupting, but I've noticed that you've been overlooked." Keanu looked up, meeting the man's gaze with quiet gratitude. "Good evening," he replied. "Thank you, but it's fine." The elderly man chuckled softly, leaning in slightly. "Sometimes being treated like this is a test of our patience," he said, his tone low. "But I must say, you're handling it with remarkable grace." Before Keanu could respond, Sarah appeared beside them, her polished smile back in place, but her eyes sharp. "Sir, is there something I can help you with?" she asked the elderly man, her voice overly polite. I wouldn't want to disturb our other guests." The man's expression darkened ever so slightly, though he maintained his composure. "Don't worry, miss," he said, his voice firm but calm. "I was simply commending this gentleman for his patience. It's not often you see such quiet dignity in the face of poor service." Sarah stiffened, her smile faltering. "Well, perhaps you should return to your table," she said, her tone clipped. "We wouldn't want to disturb anyone." The elderly man glanced at Keanu once more, offering a slight nod. "It was a pleasure speaking with you," he said. "I hope the rest of your evening is more enjoyable." Keanu returned the nod, his faint smile unwavering. "Thank you. It was a pleasure meeting you." As the man returned to his table, Sarah's facade of professionalism began to crumble. Her irritation was palpable, and though she tried to mask it, her hurried steps and clipped responses to other patrons betrayed her growing frustration. But Keanu remained unfazed, quietly enjoying his meal as the atmosphere around him continued to shift. The tension reached a breaking point when the restaurant's manager arrived. Dressed impeccably in a tailored suit, his sharp eyes immediately surveyed the room, sensing the unease in the air. When his gaze landed on Keanu, his expression changed in an instant. With a swift but composed stride, he approached the table, ignoring Sarah entirely. "Mr. Reeves," the manager said, his tone filled with respect. "I wasn't aware you were dining with us this evening. Please accept my sincerest apologies for any inconvenience. It's an honor to have you here." The room fell silent. Nearby patrons exchanged stunned glances, their whispers quickly growing louder. Sarah froze, her eyes wide as the realization dawned on her. Keanu Reeves wasn't just another customer. He was one of the restaurant's owners. The manager turned to Sarah, his expression grave. "Is there something you'd like to explain, Sarah?" he asked, his voice low but authoritative. "It seems Mr. Reeves hasn't received the level of service we pride ourselves on." Sarah stammered, her composure slipping entirely. I didn't know. I thought," she began, but the manager cut her off. "You thought what?" he said sharply. "That he didn't deserve the same respect as anyone else? That his appearance somehow determined his worth as a customer?" The words hung heavy in the air, the weight of them silencing even the softest murmurs in the dining room. Sarah's face flushed with embarrassment, her eyes darting to the floor as she struggled to respond. The realization of her actions and their consequences was sinking in, and the room seemed to hold its breath, waiting for what would come next. Keanu rose slowly from his chair, the soft scrape of wood against tile cutting through the silence that had fallen over the room. His presence seemed to fill the space, not through grandeur or bravado, but through the quiet dignity that had defined his every action that evening. All eyes were on him now, Sarah's, the manager's, the patrons, as he turned to face the room. His voice, calm yet commanding, carried effortlessly over the soft hum of the restaurant. "This restaurant was founded on a principle," he began, his tone steady but imbued with meaning. "That anyone who walks through these doors, regardless of how they dress, where they come from, or what they can afford, should feel welcome. Tonight, that principle was forgotten." Keanu's words hung in the air, their weight undeniable. Around the room, patrons shifted uncomfortably in their seats, the truth of his statement cutting through the opulence and pretense. Sarah stood frozen, her head bowed slightly, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. She dared not look up, not at Keanu, not at the other diners who were now whispering among themselves. Keanu's gaze swept across the room, meeting the eyes of a few patrons who quickly looked away. But when his eyes found the elderly man in the navy blue suit, the man held his gaze and nodded slightly. a silent affirmation of the truth Keanu was speaking. He continued, his voice softer now, almost reflective. "It's easy to make judgments," he said, "to see only what's on the surface and decide what someone is worth. We've all done it at some point, myself included. But what happens when we choose to look deeper? When we set aside our assumptions and meet people where they are?" There was a pause, a stillness in the room that felt almost sacred. Keanu took a step forward, his hands slipping into his pockets as he addressed the room with a quiet confidence. "What I've learned," he said, "is that kindness, true kindness, isn't conditional. It doesn't depend on who someone is or what they have, or even how they treat you. It's a choice, one that defines who we are, not who they are." At that moment, Sarah lifted her head, tears welling in her eyes. Her voice, quiet and trembling, broke the silence. I never thought about it that way before," she said, her words halting but genuine. "I was so focused on appearances, on what this restaurant represents, that I forgot what really matters. I forgot that every person who walks through that door deserves to be treated with respect." She turned to Keanu, her hands trembling slightly. "Mr. Reeves, I'm sorry for everything. I promise I'll change." Keanu studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then he offered her a small, encouraging smile. "That promise isn't for me," he said gently. "It's for yourself, and I believe you'll keep it." The room seemed to exhale collectively, the tension dissipating like the final notes of a song. The manager, who had been standing silently, finally spoke, his voice low but firm. "Sarah, I hope you'll reflect on this experience," he said. "This isn't just about service. It's about who we are as a team and as people." Sarah nodded, unable to speak as she wiped at her tears. The manager turned back to Keanu, his posture straightening. "Mr. Reeves," he said, "please let me assure you that this isn't the standard of Lumiere. If there's anything I can do to make this right, please let me know." Keanu shook his head, his smile kind but resolute. "There's nothing to make right," he said. "What happened tonight was a lesson for all of us. And sometimes, those lessons are more valuable than any apology." With that, Keanu reached for his jacket and slipped it on, his movements unhurried. As he turned to leave, the room seemed to follow him, every eye fixed on the man who had just delivered a masterclass in grace and humility. The elderly man in the navy blue suit raised his wine glass once more, a silent toast to the lesson they had all been taught. Keanu paused at the entrance, looking back at the restaurant one last time. The golden light of the chandeliers bathed the room in a warm glow, and for a moment, everything felt still. His voice, soft but steady, carried through the room one last time. "Kindness costs nothing," he said, "but it's worth everything." And with that, he stepped out into the cool Beverly Hills night, leaving behind a room full of people forever changed, not just by who he was, but by the quiet power of his example. The streets sparkled under the city lights, but it was the reflection of his words that lingered, illuminating hearts in a way no chandelier ever could. As Keanu stepped out into the cool night air, the golden glow of Lumiere's chandeliers fading behind him, the restaurant remained steeped in a profound stillness. Inside, the patrons sat quietly, reflecting on what had just transpired. The weight of Keanu's words lingered, like a melody that refused to fade, resonating deeply with each person who had witnessed the evening's events. Back at her station, Sarah stood motionless, her hands still trembling slightly. The tears that had welled in her eyes now streamed silently down her cheeks. But this time, they weren't from embarrassment. They were from realization. She looked around the room, at the patrons who had watched her every move, at the co-workers who had quietly disapproved, but said nothing. Most of all, she thought about the man who had handled her worst behavior with dignity and grace, never once faltering. The elderly man in the navy blue suit remained at his table, sipping his wine, slowly. He turned to his dining companion, a young woman who had been silent throughout the evening. "You see," he said softly, "that's what true strength looks like. It's not in wealth or status. It's in how a person carries themselves when faced with adversity." The young woman nodded, her gaze fixed on Sarah, who was now being approached by the manager. His expression, though serious, carried a measure of understanding. He placed a hand on her shoulder, leaning in to speak softly. "Sarah," he began, his voice steady but kind. "Tonight was a hard lesson, but it's also an opportunity. What you do from here, how you take this and grow, that's what matters." Sarah wiped her eyes, nodding as she absorbed his words. "I understand," she replied, her voice hoarse but sincere. "I won't forget this." Meanwhile, the murmurs of the other patrons began to rise. Couples leaned toward one another, recounting their impressions of Keanu and his remarkable composure. At one table, a man shook his head in disbelief. "I can't believe we were in the same room as Keanu Reeves," he said, his tone filled with awe. "And the way he handled all of that, it's not something you see every day." His companion, a woman in a striking black gown, added, "It's not just who he is, it's what he represents. He reminded us all of something we've forgotten: kindness, patience, humility." At another table, the couple who had overheard Sarah's earlier remarks exchanged knowing looks. "I hope she's learned from this," the woman said, her voice tinged with empathy. "We all have bad days, but how we respond to them, that's what defines us." The elderly man raised his glass once more, this time directing his toast toward the table where Sarah stood with the manager. Though she didn't notice it, the gesture wasn't lost on those around him. Quietly, others began to follow suit, lifting their glasses in unspoken acknowledgement of the evening's message, a ripple of collective reflection spreading across the room. Outside, Keanu walked slowly down the glittering streets of Beverly Hills, his hands tucked into his pockets. The cool air brushed against his face, carrying with it the faint hum of the city. He passed shop windows, glowing with extravagant displays, the reflections in the glass blurring the line between reality and image. But none of it seemed to register. Keanu's thoughts were elsewhere. As he reached the corner of the block, he paused, glancing back at Lumiere one last time. The restaurant stood as a beacon of opulence, its light spilling out onto the pavement, like a promise of luxury and exclusivity. Yet tonight, it had been something more. Tonight, it had been a stage for something deeper, a moment that transcended appearances and reminded everyone inside of what truly mattered. Keanu smiled faintly, his expression one of quiet satisfaction. He knew that what had unfolded wasn't just about him. It was about every person who had been watching, every patron who had felt the sting of judgment in their own lives, and every staff member who might think twice before making a snap assumption in the future. It was about Sarah standing inside the restaurant, and the choice she would make tomorrow, and the day after that, and every day that followed. The streets sparkled under the city lights as Keanu turned and continued walking, his figure gradually blending into the rhythm of the night. The world moved on, as it always did. But for those who had been inside Lumiere that evening, something had shifted. They had seen what kindness looked like in action, what grace under pressure truly meant, and they had felt its power to change not just a moment, but a mindset. And somewhere, far from the glow of the chandeliers and the whispers of the dining room, Keanu Reeves carried on as he always did. Quietly, humbly, and with the kind of strength that could move hearts without ever raising his voice.